As everybody knows, we have a YouTube channel now, and that's what these recordings are for. Today, can you start that other one? Okay, good, thank you. Today I'm in the book of Esther, and I got to tell you, I love the women of the Bible. It's so incredible the things that they did. And I've heard pastors say, well, if it wasn't for certain women in the Bible, we wouldn't be saved through Jesus. But I believe God would have used another avenue rather than the one that he took. But since he knew how everything was going to work out anyway, he was able to orchestrate this. And the women in the Bible did some incredible things for God. But something that interested me is the book of Esther. God is never mentioned by name. And to my knowledge, there's only 2 books in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, where God's name is not mentioned. The other one is the Song of Solomon. And the statement that Esther made and is famous for is, if I perish, I perish. How did Esther, a Jewish woman, get mixed up in all of the mess of the Persian government? And it was a mess, you can count on that. We know and we understand that it was God's sovereign will that brought Esther into the kingdom for such a time as this. And we know that God allowed Vashti to be deposed for insubordination, to open the door for Esther to step in as queen. And we wonder why God would allow Haman, a Jew hater, to be placed into his word. I mean, God's word tells us everything. It tells us how we are to live our lives. And yet he allowed somebody as evil as Haman to be placed in his word. But just as surely as Esther was part of God's plan, so was Haman. And God is not surprised by the Hamans of our lives. And as the story unfolds at this point, Mordecai has just been made aware of a plot by Haman to have all of the Jews killed, which is a pretty outrageous response because one little Jew wouldn't bow to him. He's going to wipe out all of the Jews. Haman sent out a decree to every province of Persia, and that was basically the known world at that time, and in every language, and he sealed it with the king's ring, which in the Persian Empire at that time, if it was sealed with the king's ring, there was no way that it was reversible. Even the king himself could not reverse it. And that's how wicked Haman was. And as we read in Esther chapter 4, verses 1 to 3, when Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out in a loud and bitter cry. And he went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one could enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. By putting on sackcloth and ashes, Mordecai was expressing great grief. And the sackcloth is made of a goat's hair or even a camel's hair, and it's very rough, very harsh against the skin. And they wore it right against their skin. Mordecai was expressing great grief in what was going on in the nation. He came before the king's gate, and it was a dangerous thing to do because no one wearing it could enter the king's gate, but he went as close as he could. And if you study the book of Esther, it's interesting to note that in every chapter to this point, there has been at least one feast. And in every succeeding chapter, there's feasting that's going on. But in this chapter, there's no feasting, only fasting. And the decree that had gone out was a death sentence for all the Jews and they knew it. In verse 4, it changes from the distress of the nation to the queen's disgrace. We read, "So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, to take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them." Now, there's a number of ways to interpret this verse. Some people say that Esther was just trying to clean up Mordecai so he could come before the king and make his plea. But most of the scholars that I have looked into believe that she was embarrassed by him. This was her guardian, walking around, mourning in sackcloth. So she sent the clothes out because his actions were embarrassing her. And I'm guessing the clothes which she had sent to Mordecai, they would have been pretty nice. They would have been stuff that would have been worn around the king. But Mordecai would not accept them. He was in deep mourning. When Mordecai sent the clothes back to her, she knew there was something big going on, and there was a big problem. So in verse 5 and 8, we learn how Esther handled the information to find out, like getting the information to find out what was wrong. And we read, "Then Esther called Haddish, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him the command concerning Mordecai to learn why this was. So Haddish went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries to destroy all of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for the destruction, which was given at Shushan, which is the palace where the king lived. That he might show it to Esther and explain it to her. And that the command that she gave the eunuch was to find out the information. So she had to wait until he brought that information back to her. And there was almost like an underground pipeline, I guess you might say, in the king's palace at that time. Mordecai got the decree, sent it to Esther, so that she could see for herself what the problem was. But Haddish must have been a very trustable person, because both Esther and Mordecai trusted him to bring the information back and forth without changing any of it, or without, of course, reporting it to the king or Haman himself. So Esther could read for herself the death sentence that had been pronounced, not just on her people, but herself as a Jew. So next we see Esther's response, and we get that in verse 9 through 11. So Haddish returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Esther spoke to Haddish and gave him a command for Mordecai. All of the king's servants and all of the people and all of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes to the inner court of the king who has not been called, he has but one law, to put that person to death, except the one that he holds out the golden scepter to, that he may live. I myself had not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So Esther sent back a message to Mordecai, saying that she can't go before the king to present this problem to the king, because the law that had been passed, that anybody going before the king who wasn't called could be killed. But Mordecai, in good faith, asked Esther to go before the king, to plead before him. that his terrible decree would be removed. But if you look at verse 11, Esther uses the king 5 times in the one verse. She could not get past the king because she knew that to go before the king without being called was basically an instant death sentence. And she did not want to risk that. So how this works is the king had many women, and he chose them according to his fancy. But he had not chosen Esther in the past 30 days, which is odd because he told her, when he married her, that she was the most beautiful in the land. And that would seem odd. But she hadn't seen him in 30 days. And now Mordecai was asking her to risk her life, to go before the king, and she couldn't do it. She's thinking that if I walk in before the king, I'm risking my own death. So she kind of passed off the whole burden of doing this. And I'm guessing here that Esther probably thought that this would be the end of the story. Well, let's look at verse 12. And this is the heart of the story. In verse 12 and 13. So they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do you think in your heart you will escape in the king's palace any more than any of the other Jews? If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther's not thinking of the fact that if the decree is carried out, it will affect her in the palace. But what Mordecai sent back to her basically gave her 3 options. Number 1, you can be destroyed, which means is just that the queen, it doesn't mean that she will escape the Jewish punishment. Number 2, she might be passed over. And the interesting thing in this verse is who could be the answer? I'm not quite sure what Mordecai was thinking at this point, but I'm guessing his faith in God would be that God would bring this about in some other way. You could be the answer, but you are not the only answer. But I'm not sure, what other option God would have used at that time. From a human perspective, Esther was their only hope. At least she looked that way. But Mordecai, being a man of faith, was believing that God would have done something another way. So, option number 1, you can be destroyed. Option number 2, God will pass you over and use somebody else, which also means destruction. Option number 3, you may have been born for such a time as this. Maybe God has placed you in this situation so that you can be God's person, even though it is very uncomfortable. And I'm sure we've all felt that, where God has put us in places that was very uncomfortable for us. So after Esther thinks this thing through, she sends back her answer to Mordecai in verse 15 and 16. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go and gather all of the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat or drink for 3 days or nights. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." And right there, that sentence makes her one of the greatest women of the Bible. She had come to the conclusion that she was going to die one way or the other if she didn't do this. So she made the decision to do the right thing. And Esther goes from being a normal woman, of that time to being a woman, to being an incredible, outstanding woman. And God, in his sovereignty, always knows what's going on. We can never outguess God, and we can never figure it out. And if you try, all you'll do is give yourself a headache. The first definition of sovereignty is you were born for such a time as this. But the response to sovereignty is to say, if that's true, I'm going to do what God wants me to do. If I perish, I perish. The definition of God's sovereignty is God, as the ruler of the universe, has the right to do whatever he wants. Further, he is in complete control over everything that happens. Now, I'm not sure how much of what Esther said in her last statement was of a spiritual decision, or if she had just worked out the other options and figured out in 11 months she was going to die anyway. So she might as well take the risk and have a possibility of escaping death if God indeed was in this whole thing. But her words have come to us with great power. There's even books out there that have been written, and their titles are, If I Perish, I Perish. And it's a reminder to us, our survival isn't the only important issue. The important issue is that we do what God tells us to do, and that we are available to God so that he can use us where he has placed us, in whatever situation we face. In 17, Mordecai says, so Mordecai went his way and did according to all Esther had commanded him. So I want to apply these truths to our heart. Sovereignty of God is often the most difficult subject that we ever discuss. Normally, it comes from the context of the free will of a man and the sovereignty of God. If anybody has been exposed to some theology, it usually comes out like this, and even in non-Christians as well. They want to know, how is it that man has free will if God is sovereign over all? And how could there be such a thing as a doctrine of election? And what do you believe about predestination, retribution, and all of those other marvelous terms in Bible discussions? Well, I want to tell you, I'm not about to solve that problem for you today. I couldn't solve it even if I wanted to. The great minds in history have wrestled with this issue of the sovereignty of God. And I guess the bottom line here is, if anybody could unravel the sovereignty of God, they would be equal to God, because it is only known to him. So you can count, that's not going to be happening. But I do know this. I can live with this information, and I can operate on it. There's only two tracks, and they run side by side from the beginning to the end. One is the sovereignty of God, and the other is the responsibility of man. Now, those tracks never meet in life. It's like a railway track. They meet in infinity. And if you look way down the road, you can see that they come together. And someday, in eternity, we will be able to figure out the issue between God's sovereignty and our responsibility. But there is a way that we must look at it. And I want to point this out to you. And it's really simple, that often we trip over it. Let God take care of his sovereignty, and let us take care of our responsibilities. Does that not just make sense? I've heard people worry over God's sovereignty. Yet, they haven't done anything for God in many years. They sit around and contemplate the sovereignty of God, but that's all they do. They sit around. And, I believe that God is very capable of taking care of his own sovereignty. I think you pretty much all agree on that one. I want to leave you with 4 or 5 things that emerge from our story on God's sovereignty and through the book of Esther. First of all, God's sovereignty explains why man alone can never fathom, what man alone can never fathom. The unknowables of life. I mean, how can you explain how Esther, a Jew, became the wife of the king of Persia? Then, why was the persecution to come to the nation? And why were the Jews to be destroyed? Now, the New Agers would say it like this. They'd say, it's karma. It's an impersonal law of the universe that pays everybody back in life for what they did in the life before, which we know is nonsense. So, these Jews must have been bad Jews in whatever life they lived before. And now they're paying for their sins of then. And that's just bunk. It's just the unknowable sovereignty of God. I heard this explanation on the sovereignty of God. It's like us looking at a tapestry, but from the wrong side. In this life, we can see all of the various threads, but to us, there's no picture. It doesn't make any sense. If you have ever looked at somebody who's done a rug hooking or things like that, if you look at the back of them, you can't tell what's on the front at all. It just looks like a complete mess. But someday in eternity, God will turn this patchwork around, and we will understand everything, and we will see the beauty of the tapestry, which is our lives. And he has woven everything that we are into this tapestry. We have to rest secure, even if we don't understand something, that God knows what's going on. Number 2, God's sovereignty encircles even those who don't know him. We often believe that God's sovereignty is for God's people. But thinking of the sovereignty of God in the story of Haman, who was brought into the picture. He is just as much a player on the stage as Mordecai is, and the sovereignty of God has drawn Xerxes, who was the king, a pleasure-loving king, who had so many wives that he couldn't count them. And if you read the story, there are 800 Jew haters that have been drawn into the story, but they are unaware of it. They have no idea that Almighty God is using them and allowing them to be part of his ultimate plan. And remember, it's always his ultimate plan. Just as surely as Esther and Mordecai are in the center of it, these people have been brought in as well. Number 3, God's sovereignty encourages us in difficult times. I'm sure that Esther had no idea of why she had been put into this situation. I mean, that was a real tough place to be in. But if she understood the sovereignty of God, she could find encouragement in even that. Sometimes God puts us in tight places, out of our comfort zone, and we don't understand why. But if we believe that there are no accidents with God, and if we are walking the best way we know how in complete obedience to the will of God, no matter how nervous it makes us. And no matter what the situation is, we can take great comfort that our God, who loves us, who created us, nothing is outside of his control. Everything that comes into your life and my life passes through the hand of our Heavenly Father. But when I keep that in mind, even during difficult days, I can be encouraged. Now, that doesn't mean to say, and I want to clarify this, people often say, well, this person or that person got sick or got cancer because God did that to them. No, God doesn't do that. Amen. He might have allowed that situation to happen, but it's us who set that situation up ourselves. It's not that it's a surprise to God, it's just that if we continue on a certain path and we do not change our path, God will allow whatever is on that path to come into our lives. Our God is never on vacation, and there are no accidents with God. But if something is in our lives, it's in our lives for a reason. I mean, God doesn't wake up one morning and say, oh my goodness, I forgot about you. And look at the mess you've made. And it's not like, we get up in the morning and we have a bunch of kids running around and we see what they did if we slept in a little bit. God never sleeps. God knows everything. If you want to read another story where the sovereignty of God works in good people and bad, read the story of Joseph. Joseph was mistreated at almost every step that he took. His brothers wanted to kill him. They sold him. He wound up as a slave. And then because he wouldn't commit adultery, he wound up in jail. But at the end of that story, his brothers were standing before him, and he said this, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And people will do things to us, and they mean it for evil, but God never does anything to us that he doesn't mean for our good. So we can take encouragement in that, even when evil people seem like they're winning. They're not. They're just part of God's plan in our lives. Number 4, God's sovereignty exempts no one from personal decisions. And please hear me on this. I have heard people say that, what's the sense of thinking about it? I don't need to make decisions anymore. God's in control anyway, and whatever will be, will be. J. Vernon McGee tells this story, and I love this story. And it really works perfectly for what I'm trying to say. There was a man who believed so much in the sovereignty of God that he would make absurd statements to Dr. McGee. And I'm presuming everybody here who not Dr. J. Vernon McGee is from, he was on WDCX. He's a Southern pastor, and he was an absolutely great man. And one day, he said this to Dr. McGee, I believe so much in the sovereignty of God that I can go out and stand in the middle of the freeway, and if my time hasn't come, I would be safe. And Dr. McGee said this, sir, if you go out and stand in the middle of the freeway, your time has come. God's sovereignty does not exempt you from personal decisions. If you jump off a cliff, you're going to die. In Esther's life, when she was brought to the kingdom for such a time as this, and she absolutely was, Esther had to make decisions to go in before Xerxes and plead for her people's lives. God did not force that decision upon her. She still had to decide to do it or not. Let God worry about his sovereignty, and you take care of your responsibilities. Don't hide behind the line that God is in control and I don't have to do anything. I'll just wait to see, basically, what God's going to do. You need to come to grips with spiritual principles. You need to make decisions. The words that Esther spoke, if I perish, are filled with the agonizing choice of making that decision to do what she believed God wanted her to do. Number 5, God's sovereignty exalts the importance of each individual. Did you ever think or feel that you're not important? Well, remember, Esther, all alone, but at the right time, making the right decisions in obedience to God. And that's always our choice, to make the right decision or the wrong decision. If we know it's of the flesh and of us, you know it's the wrong decision. And she stemmed the tide by herself that could have ultimately destroyed the Jewish nation. Just one somebody turned the course of world events. So don't ever think that one person doesn't make a difference, because as individuals, we make a difference everywhere we go. God uses everybody in his plan. Everybody is important. I don't know how you are important in your world, but you know there are people who look to you for influence. There are children, grandchildren, that look to you for advice. Looking after your mom or your dad, you are virtually important to their lives. And as you walk with God and express your love for God every day, you make a difference in your world. And that's what the sovereignty of God is teaching us. We cannot say, well, I can't do anything about it. Yes, you can. Saying I can't do anything about it is just a cop-out, and it's a lazy cop-out at that. You can do what God calls you to do. You can stand up, and you can be counted in the issues that you care about. You may not be able to change everything in the world, but in the context of your life, God can help you make a difference, because everybody counts with God. And if you want encouragement from the Old Testament, read the book of Esther. Read it all the way through. It's a marvelous story of how one person changed the course of the world at that time. And we can do the very same thing here. We might not be able to change the government. We might not be able to change some of the larger things, but if we change the person next to us, and that person changes the next person to them, and that goes out just like a ripple, through that ripple, we can change anything and we can change everything. All right, let's pray. God, let us always listen to your guidance from your word and through other people who you bring to us with your words. Let us make the right decision as we walk with you and we draw close to you. Lord, show us the way for our lives. We know that you gave us great freedom of choice. We know that there are two paths to walk, yours and ours. Lord, guide us always to walk the path that you have chosen for us. Lord, let us always use your word as a lamp to our feet on your path for our lives. Lord, I ask you for a blessing on each and every person in this church today and always, Lord. Lord, pour out your richest blessing upon each and every person in this church. And Lord, fill our church to overflow And let us stand up and be counted
Yes.
for the people that you